Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll make a start. Welcome to the BLSI on this rather drab, wet, cold day. You found refuge, which is good, and it's nice to see people in the room and quite a number of you online as well, which is great. Welcome to the World Affairs series in particular. As you know, this week is Grief Awareness Week, so this is a very topical presentations and also a discussion afterwards. So, please make the most of finding out about grief, past and present, especially given that there's so much grief out there in the world currently, internationally, globally, in Middle East, Ukraine, as well as closer to home and in our own individual families. So hopefully this will be a very productive and very enlightening series of presentations and then the Q&A afterwards. I'm really, really delighted that we're having this session today during Grief Awareness Week. Such an important topic. And I'm really looking forward to understanding how the whole concept of grief has changed over the years. It's different across cultures, in different societies, and whether there's an opportunity to return to something that isn't quite as distant and remote as it has become in much of the Western world. But now to the introductions. Now, normally I would introduce people ad lib, but unfortunately there's 3 of them today, so I need to, unfortunately, read off my pre-prepared script. I hope you don't mind. First of all, and our first speaker proper will be Dr. Molly Conisbee. She has a PhD on the social history of dying and is the author of the upcoming Wellcome book, Now Ordinary Deaths, A People's History of Mortality. She has devised and guided over 50 history walks all over the UK, including Bath, exploring themes of dying, death, grief, memorial, politics, and the environment. Dr. Helen Frisby, sitting in the middle, has a PhD on Victorian funeral customs. She publishes and speaks widely on the history and folklore of death, dying, and bereavement, including appearances on the History Channel, BBC, and ABC Radio. Helen is the author of the Shire book, Traditions of Death and Burial. And finally, but not least, is Dr. Kate Woodthorpe. She's the co-director of the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. She has published widely on funeral services, cemetery usages, and families at the end of life. She advised the Department of Works and Pensions, the Scottish Government, and the Competition and Markets Authority on all things funerals and grief-related. She has recently been awarded the prestigious Church Fellowship. Please put your hand together to welcome all 3 of them to the BLSI. I shall now hand over to Kate, who wants to say a few things.
Thank you very much. So, is this? Oh gosh, that's what a camera angle. Thank you all for coming. Good evening. I'm very grateful for your in-person attendance today, and hello everyone online, but particularly to those of you in the room because this is not Bath at its finest this evening. It is very wet, and it's very easy to have just sacked this off, quite frankly. So I'm very grateful for you all for making the effort to come here this evening. Thank you. So, like Andreas said, my name's Kate. I'm one of the directors of the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. Now, that is a research centre that's nearly 20 years old. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this time next year, which is that's a long time actually for a research centre at a university. So we're very proud of that. We are considered, especially because we're often considered quite niche. And I think part of that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is that actually death is not that niche. It's one of the very few universal experiences, obviously, that we will all encounter. And that we have been championing, we're not clinicians at Bath. We are people who are working more in the social sciences and humanities. So we're looking at the social and historical, cultural aspects of death, dying, and bereavement. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is Molly and Helen are 2 social historians, and I'm a sociologist. So we're going to be talking more about the socio-historical, political economic context of bereavement, which is often lost. It's still huge, and I'll point to some of the books I brought with me. In terms of, you know, why people behave the way that they do, why society and why populations respond to death in particular ways. There are all sorts of massive reasons, I'm sure you can imagine. But actually the impact of loss is much more than emotion. And it is very much connected into how people live their lives. And I think that's probably going to be one of the predominant messages of this evening. Now we're going to, like Andrea said, we're going to speak for 15 minutes each. So I will keep a little timer, give you a 2-minute warning. Helen, I think, has got some notes. You both got nice flashcards, and but Helen has timed herself. Molly doesn't know where she might end up. I'm going to respond. So it's going to be very organic, and we don't quite know where we're going to end up with the conversation, but I think that's part of the privilege of talking about this as well. And we would really welcome at the end, if you feel able to reflect on what we've talked about or give your views or your own personal experiences, we would very much welcome them. We are by no means, we're just 3 voices. Everyone has got, usually people have got an opinion on this, and quite rightly so. So we welcome any discussion at the end. And who knows where we will end up at the point that I'm back up here and finishing my little spiel to then hand it over to you. So I look forward to the next 45 minutes. Thank you very much again for coming. Molly, over to you.
Just to reiterate what Kate said, this is a nasty night, so thank you so much for coming, and hello to people online. When we were talking about how to structure this session, we thought we would all start with just saying very briefly what interested us, got us into researching dying, death, grief and associated issues. And I can pinpoint my interest really specifically to when I was at school. Our history teacher asked us to ask our grandparents or elder carers or elder people in our lives what the biggest social change in their lives had been. And I was very fortunate at the time. I had 4 surviving grandparents, and 2 of them immediately said that the biggest social change in their lifetimes had been child mortality. And I found that astonishing at the time. My grandfather particularly, he'd been born in 1905 in Germany. He came to this country as a refugee. Most of his family were wiped out in the Holocaust. He was old enough to remember Berlin after World War I, eating bark off the trees because he was so hungry as a child. And I remember asking my mother at the time, I said, well, this is incredible, the things he's been through, how on earth is child mortality the biggest change in his lifetime? And as she pointed out to me, he was one of 4 children, 2 of whom died before the age of 5. So one died of diphtheria, which is a horrible, horrible end of life, and one died of sepsis. And as I've grown older, I've reflected, obviously he's sort of long gone now, and I've reflected more and more about this experience. And I think that really sort of drew me to archives and to researching this, because it felt like within living memory of my own family, there were people who'd experienced these kind of incredible levels of loss, which at least in the sort of global north now feels sort of unimaginable to us. In terms of, and that being a fairly typical, family story, really. So that was really what I think sparked my initial interest in researching this, in really understanding the impact that loss and grief and bereavement played in people's lives. Kate also asked us just to, rather than have slides, just to have one image, and I will return to this image. It's actually a morning teapot, and I will touch on this sort of a bit in the talk and then towards the end of the talk. So this is very much about a sort of popular cultural motif of loss. And for me, it's my own teapot. It's actually going to feature in the book, and it was actually cheaper for me to buy one on eBay than to pay the V&A for the copyright for an image in the book. So, but I will touch on kind of popular culture of mourning and death. But as I say, that very sort of intimate experience of my grandfather's, you know, really kind of, I think, motivated or sparked my early interest in researching dying and death. I think sometimes, as Kate touched upon, I'm kind of currently got a book that should be, well, evolution moves more quickly than the publishing industry, but there is a book coming, which is called No Ordinary Deaths, A People's History of Mortality. And in it, when you study death, you often study, well, when I was at school, you studied the deaths of kings and queens and politicians and the kind of elites, as it were. What can be harder to unearth, and I think Helen's going to touch on this as well, the stories of kind of sort of ordinary people. I don't like the term, but, you know, ordinary people, everyday life and death. And part of that can be just because the sources are actually harder, you know, people who didn't leave wills and testaments and diaries and so on. So a lot of, I think probably what Helen and I are going to talk to tonight is how do you access what those kind of experiences of grief were and what people's experience of loss was, who didn't sort of leave these, you know, sort of long narratives about their, you know, about their kind of family situation. And it was a real challenge when I was writing the book about how to find the spaces and how to find the narratives about people's experience of loss, because as I say, as I've touched on with my own grandfather, most people experienced high levels of loss within their lives. I'm going to start with the term grief, which comes from the Old French crever, which is to burden, so something we carry with us, something which is the kind of internal manifestation. Often as researchers, we look at the external manifestations of grief, so objects of, you know, we're going to look at some things that Helen's brought as well, but external objects. But how do we actually tap into how people really felt? And there is a strand of historical thought that suggests that people didn't feel grief as profoundly in the past as we do now because they were inured to loss. You know, if you had children, you expected to lose them because, you know, child mortality rates were so high. Helen and I have talked about this a lot, and we disagree with this completely. We think, she's speaking for Helen, we think actually grief was just as profoundly felt. It's just that it manifested differently sometimes. And also we have to explore the spaces and sometimes the silences that people left in order to really interpret how grief was experienced historically. There is, you know, a lack of documentary evidence. But I think if you kind of look a bit more broadly at the evidence that we do have, you can see that grief has been very present with our ancestors, and they've had to sit with it in the same way that we have had to learn to sit with it when we've experienced losses in our own lives. So, for example, there is a huge long history, I won't go into it this evening, but there's a huge history of consolatory literature, for example, explaining, you know, how to deal with loss, how to expect and anticipate loss, and then how to comfort the dying, and then how to kind of sit with your own grief. Excavations of burial grounds, for example, reveal, you know, incredibly sort of tender burials of small children, you know, buried with favourite toys, buried with extreme care, people buried with favourite objects and pieces of jewellery, for example. So I think we can sort of see from kind of those behaviours that loss and grief were kind of profoundly experienced. And when researching my own book, one of the sources I found, which was very rich in terms of understanding grief, particularly resided in things like coroner's notes and asylum notes, for example. So, for example, I've spent a lot of time looking at coroner's records from the 18th and 19th centuries and finding stories of, well, consider a young woman called Eliza Bates in Southwark, who completed suicide in 1842 because she was driven wild with grief after the death of her husband and child. Or of Euphemia Bracken, a woman who is buried near where I live here in Bath, who was committed to the Reigate Asylum in 1902 in a stupor after the death of her own child, her youngest son. So there are records that, if we kind of think sort of creatively, as it were, about how we interpret grief, where we can find these stories about people's sense of loss and their experience of loss. There's a story I talk about in the book about a young woman called Lydia Stather, who was born in 1869 in Sculcoats in Hull. And she was, her parents were called Anne and James, and she was one of 6 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. Anne, her mother, Lydia's mother, was a full-time parent, and her father, James, worked as a bone boiler, which was a sort of smelly, dangerous trade. It was called one of the sort of dirty trades in the 19th century. And Lydia, who was the only surviving daughter of Anne and James, was described as a very sort of delicate child. Delicate can mean a number of things, by the way, in the 19th century. It might have meant that she was simply petite and small. It might also have meant that she had tuberculosis, because in Sculcoats in Hull, tuberculosis levels were incredibly high. There have been several excavations of cemeteries in Hull, and the levels of tuberculosis were well above the average for the 19th century. So she might have been tubercular. So Lydia was extremely close to her mother. Her father died suddenly in 1876 when Lydia was 7. And this sort of seemed to draw mother and daughter more closely together. So she had 4 brothers who sort of grew up and left home and married and had families of their own, but Lydia and her mother stayed together. When Lydia was 21, her mother Anne died very suddenly of a heart attack. Took me a while to sort of track down the death certificate, but it was evidently a very, very sudden death. As we know now, sudden death can be extremely traumatic for people to experience. Death is always traumatic, but sudden death can be extremely complicated. And a week after Anne's death, in September 1890, Lydia herself disappeared. And so the family went and did a big search for her. And a few hours after her disappearance, about 10 hours after her disappearance, her shawl was found sort of folded neatly on the dock of on the side of the dock in Hull. And about 8 hours after that, Lydia herself, unfortunately, was found drowned in the waters. Now, we know about Lydia's story because there was a coroner's inquest, and several members of her family spoke about her. They talked about her unconsolable grief. They talked about her closeness to her mother. They talked about the fact that she had wept since her mother had died. When Lydia completed suicide, suicide was illegal. Shockingly, it was illegal, as you probably know, until 1966. So auto da fe, it was called self-murder. But actually coroners, in fact, if you go through coroners' records, were often really, really sympathetic to people who completed suicide. So I think in the kind of the hundreds of coroners' records I've been through, I think only one ever put suicide as the cause of death. So what coroners used to do was put all kinds of other reasons, like temporary insanity or lunacy or found drowned, because if you were defined as a suicide, your family lost access to your body. You weren't allowed a Christian burial. They couldn't have access to the things that you left behind, any property or clothes or things. So coroners and coroners' juries went to huge lengths to actually make sure that suicide was never the sort of defined cause of death. And I think for me, again, talking about the silences and the difficulties of understanding grief and loss, this is a really sort of profound insight. The fact that people were people were kind of defined as you know, caught in sadness, or you know, sort of caught in this sort of emotional state, which is really empathetic actually. And they weren't defined as ending their own lives. They were defined in this kind of moment of kind of extreme emotion, which we would now probably understand as grief. And now, you know, perhaps we have the language of, you know, psychology and psychoanalysis. We can sort of understand that kind of grief that people experience after a death. But this is, you know, this is pre-Freud. This is, you know, this is a moment when people didn't necessarily know how to define that sadness, but they still did, and they avoided the kind of language of suicide. So I think it's a kind of wonderful kind of empathetic space in which grief was really held and understood for people. As I said, it meant that families could claim the body, they could claim the goods, they could claim the memory of a person without shame. And you know, the concept of shame is a topic of a whole other conversation. So as I said, verdicts would often say, you know, temporary insanity, or, you know, they were very, very mindful and caring. And in Lydia's case, her notes stated, you know, that her mother had died recently. It greatly affected her mind. She was in despair. It was very, very, the notes from her coroner's inquest are so sympathetic and so beautifully held for her loss and her grief. So what do I understand from Lydia and her experience about grief? I think it really beautifully demonstrates the human story of grief. There are many other stories in the book and other people's research, I know. I think it was understood in the past. I think it was held in the past in the way that we don't always appreciate. There was maybe no counselling or therapy in those days, but I think it was grasped that grief could flood and overwhelm the senses. I think, you know, we can only glimpse kind of lived experiences like Lydia's. And I know that Helen is going to talk much more about the sort of sources and silences around grief. So just very briefly before I wind up, hence my teapot. This is a Jackfield teapot. Jackfield was as a sort of Shropshire potters, and they were famous for the sort of black pottery, but this became very fashionable in the 19th century as mourning teapots. So if you were in bereavement, which you would have spent a lot of your life as a 19th century person, you would have spent a lot of your life in bereavement. You might well have had a mourning teapot, and if people came to see you, they would know where you were in your grief by your tea set, obviously by your clothes as well. And I think Helen's going to share some of her beautiful jewellery as well here. They would have known by your clothes, but even the tea that you served, this is, you know, sort of black porcelain, and it's a forget-me-not, obviously, you know, a symbol of loss and mourning. But yes, it's perhaps sometimes kitsch somewhat to our kind of modern sensibilities, but people held grief in the past in ways that I think we need to appreciate. And I would argue, perhaps controversially, that we can somewhat learn from as well, that we can actually learn from symbols and signs, and you know, we can sort of learn to hold that space in contemporary life as well. Don't necessarily advocate rushing out and buying a mourning teapot, but that, you know, but there was this sort of, one thing I just want to say before I finish, Lydia Stather, our young person, she was found because her shawl was folded on the edge of the dock before she completed suicide. And I find that a very moving detail, partly because we know that cloth and fabric was extremely valuable. It might have been her mother's shawl that she inherited. I can't find that detail. But this material thing that she left as a little sign of her departure and her loss and her grief, I find very moving. And I think objects, even like, as I say, this maybe slightly kitsch teapot, kind of really symbolise this this kind of sense of grief as kind of positioned in the kind of domestic and emotional space of daily life and the everyday. And I think that's what I'd like to say. So, thank you very much. What's coming later? Oh, well. I'm often asked, how does a nice young-ish historian get into this sort of topic? We'll start with the conventional answer that you spot a gap in the literature and you figure out a way to fill that gap. And that a few years down the line, they give you a PhD for it. And then suddenly here you are, and it's, 15 years later, and you're wondering where all the time went. So I want to start by talking a little bit about that literature trail, what we historians call the historiography, what other historians have said about the topic, because that's usually our way into something, isn't it? And this all started back in about 1950s, 60s with Geoffrey Gorer, who wasn't actually a historian, but he did write recalling his own Edwardian childhood and experiences of grief and loss within his family, and his sense that since that time death had become, even in his own lifetime, had become a much lonelier and perhaps even a taboo experience. He wrote an article called The Pornography of Death, which suggested that just as sex was such a taboo in the Victorian era, but death wasn't, now the positions in the mid-20th century had become reversed. David Caladine's quote here is a reaction to what he perceived as Gorer's cosy nostalgia. Caladine was wanting to make a point, and as people often do when they want to make a point, he perhaps went rather the other way and was quite perhaps dismissive of Victorian funeral customs. I think as is often the case, the truth perhaps lies somewhere in the middle. But back to our literary trail, and the big history of death, the one everyone always refers to, even now, is REA's 1981, The Hour of Our Death. And again, REA had this idea that, since the Middle Ages, so he took a much broader sweep of time. Since the Middle Ages, death has gone from becoming tame, part of normal everyday life, to being untamed, something to be feared and pushed away and corralled and contained. And that had perhaps some merit, but it also had some problems. For a start, he sort of focused very much on the kind of the French context, which has a very different kind of social and cultural and confessional history to Britain. He also focused very much on social elites. He used a lot of evidence from literature and diaries, and the kind of evidence that the literate, leisured, moneyed elites tend to have the resources both to produce in the first place and then to leave for historians to happen to find later. You could perhaps take this a bit further and argue that most history making is an inherently privileged middle class activity. It involves privileged middle class people in the present day, constructing the past based on the leavings of other privileged middle class people in the past. You might not want to take it that far. And certainly in the late 1980s, we see a little glut of sort of books that react against that position. So we have Ruth Richardson's book, Death, Dissection and the Destitute, which very much positioned the 1832 Anatomy Act as an act of appropriation of the bodies of the poor, and particularly the poor who had been unfortunate enough to die in the workhouse. We also had Sylvia Bernard's book, To Prove I'm Not Forgot, Living and Dying in a Victorian City. I've been very careful to give you the full title there because that Victorian city just happened to be my home city of Leeds. So I was with a particular personal connection to that one. and she particularly talked about the guinea graves. So you could, if you couldn't quite afford your own personal grave, you could, for a guinea, which was quite a lot for an ordinary working family, you could buy a slot in this grave. You would be with about a dozen or so strangers, but you would at least have your name on a headstone. And she very evocatively likens that to the sort of back-to-back terraced houses from which these people would have, where they would have lived. So we now have both the social extremes covered. We had the sort of the ritual drama of the kind of Victorian and Edwardian elite funeral, and we had, if you like, the ritual undrama of the pauper funeral. And with the work of Pat Dalland in 1990, we saw perhaps a return, shall we say, to some familiar and comfortable historical territory of the more elite Victorian funeral experience, with lots of lovely documentary evidence, the wills and the household accounts and the diaries and so on. But she did acknowledge that there was still this gap with what we very loosely and baggily call ordinary people. So not the ritual drama of either social extreme, but the sort of, if you like, the respectable sort of upper working and lower middle classes. And this was a gap finally tackled, by Julie Marie Strange in 2005. And she took a really interesting approach. She took this reading the silences approach that Molly and I have been mentioning. So, for example, in the case of gravestones, we often find in the burial board minute books of the time, we often find complaints that working class families, they've gone to all the trouble of buying a grave, and would they just please jolly well get on and put the headstone on as they've undertaken to do if they don't terribly mind. And perhaps, you can read that at face value, perhaps as evidence of, that people are neglecting their dead, they're moving on, they don't care, they're too consumed by the trials and tribulations of ordinary working life. Or, as Julie Marie argued, you can look at it a little bit differently, and you can see it as that people have put all the resources that they have into buying that grave, and that they're perhaps, while they can't perhaps quite afford that final step of a headstone, nonetheless they're there, they're tending the grave. There are the sort of temporary material culture tributes that haven't stood the test of time are being put there. So people are doing what they can within the resources that they have to hand and the stuff of everyday life that they have around them. And this approach was part of something called the emotional or the affective turn that was happening in social history at the time. So we were moving away from all that sort of battles, kings and queens type history, and moving very much into sort of the personal, the micro history, the everyday. And my own work has, to a great extent, been influenced by those kind of themes. Although I was lucky enough to stumble by one of those wonderful accidents that you have sometimes when you're doing research. You walk into a library and you pick up a book and you think, this is it. This is where I need to go. And in my case, that was using historic antiquarian evidence to sort of piece together the kinds of this sort of complex of folk customs by which people got the dead where they need to go and the bereaved where they needed to be, if you like. The things like laying out, making burial clothes, having people round to visit, to have one last ritual touch, to eat and drink together, the custom of waking, of opening the window to let the soul out, a penny for St. Peter, telling the bees, I could go on. And a whole set as well of behaviours and beliefs around death portents, which again could be a talk in themselves. So that's the story I told in my PhD viva. And it's a story, if I'm honest, I still tell most people. But it doesn't quite answer the question, does it really? Still doesn't answer why I found this particular set of literature appealing and interesting. And this is the point. where I introduce you to Nellie. Nellie, as you might be guessing, is or was my grandma. As you can see, she was actually born right on the cusp of that world that I now study as history. And because we tend to have children later in life in my family, she was already well into her 60s when I came along as a bit of a late surprise. I'm by some way the youngest of the 4 grandchildren, and I was really very lucky that I got to hang out with her a lot as a young child. She taught me to cook, to sew. She took me to McDonald's a lot just because my mother didn't approve, so she made sure to take me. She liked a nip of whiskey or 3 in her tea, and she was an absolute demon at dominoes. She died, as you can see, just before Christmas 2000, after being ill with stomach cancer for 6 months. We nursed her at home, and I'm really glad I have all those memories of her, because those memories were certainly not represented at the funeral. It was, I'll be really honest with you, it was the absolute worst of the late 90s, early 2000s, 20 minutes in and out of the crematorium, production line funeral. And I think it's testament, to when I think back to the British taboo against making a fuss in public, that I didn't get up and hit the vicar and walk out there and then. I really wanted to do that at the time. And so, quite apart from the historiography and the sources, this is the fire that's kept me going for the last 20 years, the belief that funerals can be better. And that perhaps, just perhaps, the past might be a resource for doing that. Now, to some extent, and this is where we come back to the quote on the right, David Cannadine had a point. For all his hyperbole, he had a point, that there is a fine, often fuzzy, but really important line between history and nostalgia. A really good example of that is a chapel of rest. This was an American innovation which came to this country in the early 1930s. And it was an absolute hit. People loved it. And I think part of the reason that people loved it was because it gave them privacy and control. I talked earlier about all those, visiting and hospitality customs. And yes, I'm sure it was comforting having people around to, share and perform and rehearse memories of the person who died and to start to confront the reality of what had happened. But it must also have been really intrusive having all the neighbours trooping through the house during what was probably the worst week of your life. And it would have been really financially burdensome too, having to feed and water everyone. So change does happen for a reason, and it's really important to remember that. But then, being an academic, I kind of go to the other side of things and I think, well, maybe Gora also had a point that perhaps over the course of the 20th century, perhaps we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater to some degree. Perhaps we have lost a lot of that ritual framework, which helps us navigate and renegotiate our relationships with the person who's died. I'm really not so keen, I have to say, on that sort of Freudian view that that grief is about getting to the point as if the person who's died has never existed. Rather, I see grief as a process of getting to the point, hopefully, eventually, where your relationship with the person who's died no longer requires their physical presence in the room. That's not the same as forgetting that they ever existed. And there are, of course, many things about historic ways of death that we wouldn't want back. Molly, you talked very evocatively about child mortality. My own grandmother lost her mother very young as well. We wouldn't want to go back to the days of little effective pain relief, of the way that suicides were treated historically as well. But still, I maintain, there has to be a better way. And this is where I think I come on to the sort of notion of reinvented tradition, or perhaps a little more colloquially, old customs in new clothes. We probably don't want, and we probably shouldn't want to reinvent the past wholesale. But actually, when you look at a lot of, sort of current day emerging funeral customs, they've got more than a whiff to me of the past about them. A really good example of that is the is human composting, which is most definitely coming down the line at us. It's now legal in several parts of the states. It's probably going to be here sooner rather than later. And perhaps, yes, that might seem new and radical. But to me as a historian, what I'm also seeing is a sort of, but not quite, because of course history never lands in quite the same place, does it? To the sort of the medieval notion of what Paul Binsky calls the sacred recycling of the body. So I'm a great believer that history does sort of come round in all sorts of curious and interesting ways. So I'm going to leave it there with, I think, a couple of minutes to spare. And there we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So, let me get my book. Hello, everyone. Hello, online. So I'm Kate, and I'm going to take us up to the present day. Let me just start my little timer. Look at the clock, sorry. Right. I've been furiously taking notes, and I hope I cover everything. But one of the things I wanted to just briefly flag up, I brought some books with me, of which you're welcome to have a look at the end. Some examples of some of the, well, I think good examples of literature that's available about contemporary deaths. But probably the best book, I mean, I took this photo this morning, by the way, just because I have a lot of books at home. I read this for fun. And I wanted to highlight, I was mentioning it to Sally earlier at the back there, but what I think is one of the best books I have ever read on death and dying is by Seamus O'Mahony, on how we die now, the way we die now. He's a clinician in Ireland. He's written 3 books, and he's written another one about how medicine's being cured. Can medicine be cured? And I'm going to refer to that a few times, or some of the themes that come out in his work. But this is just to give you an example. This is a snapshot of the sheer, there is, if you go to any bookshop now in the self-help section, there will be a substantial number of books on death and dying, end of life in intensive care or in medical institutions. It's becoming a very popular subject. But academically, Helen has mentioned Pat Jalland already, and I cannot recommend this book highly enough. If you're interested in the sort of social history, the recent social history of death and dying, this book is called Death in War and Peace, A History of Loss and Grief in England, 1914 to 1970. It is one of, oh, there was Seamus. It is one of the best books I have ever read. And the reason I want to flag it up now is because Helen and Molly have talked about death in the past, and this kind of fast forwards us through the 20th century. And I'll then talk now about the last sort of 30, 40 years. But this book, I think it is based on elites, a lot of it, but there are there's some accounts of miners' deaths and men who got trapped in explosions underground and were left to die, and the devastation of communities. But what she does so well, I think, is show how economic and political contexts shape how death both occurs and then grief is experienced. So she writes about how in the 20th century occupations, this country in England went through profound shifts in the economy, moving from a manufacturing country towards a service economy, and what that meant for jobs and the risk associated with jobs. So she talks about miners, for example, where it was relatively common. It was a quite dangerous occupation. I come from a family of miners, one of them, one side of the family, and it was just routine. My great-grandfather died of a heart attack at a young age, probably to do with the conditions in which he was going down the mine. So, she said something about child mortality as well. So she kind of connects up death to these very big social and political changes. And she talks about the Spanish flu that was around World War One, which doesn't get as much coverage. But it does now, actually, probably post-COVID. This was written before COVID, but recognition of the impact of a pandemic on how people approach death because of its kind of ubiquity, its indiscriminate impact across the population. So I'd strongly recommend that book if you're interested in the social history, and you're welcome to come and have a flick through of it at the end. Now, where I want to take us to, you talked also about personal experience. I guess I've written about my personal experience already, so it's already out there in the public domain. But I think it is worth just acknowledging, because I have noticed this, that when you're doing this work as an academic, writing about grief and bereavement and loss, it's often like a qualification. People ask you, well, what means it? What gives you the right to talk about it? What qualifies you to talk about it? So I've got quite used to talking about what exposed me to it very early on. And that was 4 friends of mine were killed in a car crash when I was 17. A bit like that awful case last week of the 4 young men who drowned in a car. It was quite similar to that. Utterly shocking, life-changing. And I think what that did is expose me to the fact that it can happen at any time. There are no guarantees. We all know that. You're an audience who's here and engaged in it and online. But there are no guarantees, and that is that's driven me, I think, to actually try and make the most of life as a result. But one of the things that I think where that has also come from is the fact that, in my view, and I don't think this is rocket science, and Pat Jalland, who's written about this, some of the people over there in the other books have written about this a lot. A significant problem is that the forces of the 21st century have almost conspired against us to defamiliarize, detool, disempower us in the UK when it comes to grief and bereavement, because of huge advances in medicine and public health, which has meant that people are living longer and longer and longer. People who are alive today in their 80s and 90s never, ever thought that they were going to live that long. It's the oldest people have ever lived right now, and it is now commonplace for 3 or 4 generations to be living at one time, which is incredible progress. But what that has meant as a result is that there are generations of people who have never experienced profound loss. Child mortality is a very big one as well. Children are now, routinely, it is a tragedy for a child to die before adulthood. Women do not die in childbirth. There is men do not go down the mines and die. We are cocooned. We are in a very privileged country here in the UK, but we're not unique. That is, in a lot of the countries in the global north, and increasingly in the global south. So the global south, people who are living in the African continent, South America, they are starting to live longer and longer as well, as sanitation improves, infectious disease control improves, etc. So the population on this planet is aging. And that means that death is increasingly unfamiliar. And that has led to, in my view, it's led to a lot of theories about grief and bereavement by academics, and some of those you'll be more familiar with than others, but that has pushed grief behind closed doors, and that's what Pat Jalland has written about, and lots of psychologists have written about. And it has moved this more social understanding, perhaps, of signifiers of bereavement, and a more communal understanding of death. It has become a much more individual experience, and the emphasis within the psychological discourse, at least, is about the internal emotions of the person, about how they're handling it, because it's just not there in the public domain. It's not out on the streets. People aren't talking about it. It's not routine in everyday life. And, some of the most common theories are about, some kind of work to get through grief, the emotion, you've got to do some processing or some moving between phases or tasks. There is a lot of debate about whether you can ever achieve closure, or whether you actually, it's about accommodation, or that grief, life grows around the grief experience. But in my view, as a sociologist, I think some of that is actually now going too far. We are going to the point where we're over psychologizing grief, and it is being forced into a very reductive, it's looking for explanation for normal, everyday human experience. And one of the things that I think has not shocked me, it doesn't shock me, but concerns me, and I'm just going to get it up on my phone, is those of you may be aware of this or not, but grief has recently been included in a diagnostic manual in the United States, pathological grief disorder. And I'm just getting up how it's defined, because there has been quite a lot of pushback on that, because it's over psychiatrizing. That's the right word. I can't think that's the right word, but it's over medicalizing an emotion and a normal response to a significant life event. And there's been, if I just read out to you very briefly, and I can understand why this is in the manual of what is prolonged grief disorder. For a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, the loss of a loved one had to have occurred at least a year ago for adults and at least 6 months ago for children and adolescents. In addition, the grieving individual must have experienced at least 3 of the symptoms below nearly every day for at least the last month prior to that diagnosis. Symptoms include identity disruption, marked sense of disbelief, avoidance of reminders, difficulty with reintegration, emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, intense loneliness. I would say that quite a lot of people are actually living with that on an everyday experience already before a loss. But that, to me, as a sociologist, I'm not clinical, but it's quite a normal reaction, even a year after someone's death, particularly a spouse, or a child. But it also sets up people to fail. Actually, it sets them up to say that there's something wrong with you if you are not somehow responding or bouncing back within a particular time frame. And there is a small but growing group of people who are starting to say, hang on a minute, there's also a very big commercial imperative to that diagnosis. What on earth is happening? This is an open door now for pharmaceuticals companies to start coming up with treatments to actually respond to grief as a problem, as a clinical problem. And I think it is a very big slippery slope that people are heading towards. So that's what's going on in one world, where we are right now. I think the problem with that is also it assumes that there is some kind of baseline that everyone in this room has a normal, we're all the same before that death happens. Whereas actually some people, even within this room, are going to be just more emotional than others, or more prone to feelings of loneliness and isolation, or more likely to feel numb about world events, what's going on at the moment, because they can disassociate from it much more easily than other people. Some people will feel very deeply invested in the injustice in the world compared to others. And that diagnosis, going down that clinical kind of diagnostic route, does not accommodate the huge diversity of a baggage that someone brings with them to when a significant loss happens, which will then also shape how they respond to it. So as a sociologist, I'm very much about, you need to understand responses to loss in the context in which people are living their lives. And the problem with that, and the problem with, quite frankly, a lot of this as well, and the problem with, it's my own research as well, I recognize it, is that it is, I can't remember who said, of you guys, but it's still very white middle class. And it is actually, death is hugely unequal in this country and around the world. And we're not paying attention to that. And we risk also putting middle class, and I say that as shorthand for lots of things, but putting values on death and end of life that don't resonate with vast majorities of populations. So we've just had a paper that came out in Sociology on trying to argue that death needs to be understood relationally, and that was this paper led by Jane Ribbons McCarthy. I'd be happy to send it to anyone if you wanted to have a copy of it. And that is, and she did some research in Senegal and was finding that, you know, in the African continent and in that country especially, what death meant was completely different to the global north. It was a much more collective experience. The understandings of ancestry were completely different. So the understandings of loss were completely different. But all these theories about bereavement, it's just not there. Understanding that there are there's a huge diversity of experience and understandings. And in a global world where migration is now very common, she was arguing, we're arguing that we have a responsibility to actually recognise that and stop foisting these very Western industrialised or post-industrial views of what life is about and what bereavement is about. So, and in the UK especially, that's to do with also poverty. You know, that a lot of this and a lot about grief and bereavement is based on choice. So this idea that you've got choices when people die, or you can, you know, I actually feel very much that grief is quite a privileged position to be in. So for a lot of people, actually having the time to be bereaved, it's just not possible if you're on a shift pattern and caring for an elderly father who's failing, worried about paying your rent, and your landlord's potentially turfing you out. You can't even cope with the fact your mother's just died. You've got to actually just cope with living. And we did a study on that about funeral choices that told us that. And where we're going, just to end very briefly for a minute, I suspect we're going, in this country, COVID has accelerated things that were already happening in terms of grief increasingly going behind closed doors and funerals going behind closed doors. So we're now seeing rises in direct cremation, which is where people don't have a funeral and the body after someone has died is taken away, cremated, and the ashes are returned at a later date. We did a study on that before COVID and found that the people that were choosing to do that, again, a choice, weren't doing it for money. They were, because of the cost of funerals, it's about £4,000 to £5,000 for an average funeral now. They weren't doing it for that cost, they were doing it about control. So they were all actually doing some kind of ritual behind closed doors, and they wanted control over what was going to what was happening. And I think that is actually going to become the bigger issue. So the move of grief behind closed doors and funerals behind closed doors is a product of what's been happening since the 1950s. You know, thinking back to Pat Jallen's book, that's already been happening in terms of the increasing privatization of life and the increasing individualization of people's experiences. We're not doing the signifiers anymore. We're not wearing colour. We're not doing things that signify to other people of what we're going through. We retreat, and we are more private individuals than we've ever been. So, and that direct cremation is the natural sort of end point of that. So that's where we're going. That's where I think. But obviously we welcome all comments and thoughts based on anything that we've said tonight. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, very interesting views and on a very, very important topic. So before we get to the Q&A session, I'm going to get Ollie, who's our resident technical expert, to move the camera to light up these three ladies for the Q&A session so that everybody can actually see them online. So I hope Ollie is on his way up to do, here he is. Ollie is here. But whilst Ollie's doing that, could you please put your hands together one more time for all three contributions? So whilst we're sorting this out online, let's start with questions in the room. Who wants to go first? Oh, there's a lady over there. If you speak directly into it like that.
As usual, I very much enjoyed listening to all three of you talk. I had a question that kind of came into my mind when I was listening to you talk about differences in ritual. One of the things I experience, or I've seen a lot, is a lot more people directly now ask, but how did they die? They want to know about the death. And I wonder if that's partly because of the disconnectedness that we have now, that people are curious because they don't see or experience death as much as people did in the past. And if you see, you look at when famous people die, people want to know how. And it's just one of those questions. And I don't know whether it's a death avoidance. If I don't do that thing, then it won't happen to me. Or do you think maybe it's about because we just don't talk about it? It seems the only time we can talk about it. So maybe ask what might be an intrusive question of someone.
What comes to my mind when you ask that question, Janine, and thank you, it's a great question. So I've got to talk right to the microphone, apparently. What comes to my mind is the proliferation of wayside memorials over the last 30 years or so, which are very much about the occasion of the death rather than post, and they're quite often about what's happened, aren't they? They can be a social protest about knife crime or, speeding traffic or whatever caused that particular death as much as that individual's death. So yes, I think you might well be onto something there.
I think also what's fascinated me is the change in professions around death. So if you think about sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century, you might employ a watcher. If you knew someone was towards the end of life, you might employ someone literally to sort of sit with them and then to kind of record, their last moments and record their kind of dialogue with, often in a religious context. And so I think there was a real interest in how people died and the nature of a good death. And that's what a lot of consolatory literature is about as well. And I agree with you, because we've sort of hived that off maybe more to sort of institutions, hospitals, hospices. We don't always actually know how somebody ends their time. And so I think that almost makes it more. I ask now when someone mentions a relative, I always say, can't stop myself, was it a good death? I mean, then I think, oh gosh, I spend my days reading about this stuff, and maybe they find that kind of an inappropriate thing to ask. But I think in the past that was actually part of the journey, was to actually record and to kind of relate to how people actually left life, as it were. So I think that's a really interesting point you're making, and something I feel we should talk about. Personally, I think it's actually an important part of embracing being alive and the cycle that we're all going to go through.
You've made me think now, Molly, of the sort of functions of customs like waking as well, and about the sort of the funeral tea and the importance of the sort of the gathering to rehearse and perform and confront those memories and begin to process them. And of course we've talked about how that's had there was another side to the coin of that as well, of course, but yes, it's all in a theme, isn't it?
And sitting with people, being with them, having them in the home, having them in the home, the burying with objects. I was reading about a excavation in Hull particularly, and how almost everybody in this one particular graveyard they excavated was buried with like a teacup or a bottle of beer, or there was a very sociable aspect to those kind of burials. So yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting point you make.
Okay, thank you very much. For those of you online, you're now on our big screen in the room. Feel free to unmute and show your screen and ask a question. But before, please do. In the meantime, we're going to have another question in the room. I'm just going to go across the camera very quickly. There you go. Speak directly.
Hello. So my personal interest is in 19th century rural forest death. However, I've also have a real interest in motorbike funerals and biker gang funerals. And I think to sort of come back to the modern idea that you were talking about, Kate, about people giving it ownership and pulling back, and almost separating themselves away. Do you think there's also a counterculture in that? Like, for example, the neo-tribes, like with Bauman, that people are actually forging new ways of commemoration that's this bigger sort of gang, and I use that with a small g, sort of family way of following these old anthropological traditions that we've seen in the past, and kind of almost creating a counterculture against this move towards solitary ownership. Do you think that's going to take over as an oppositional?
I felt that at the end of COVID, I would get asked quite a lot by journalists of what do you think is going to happen? Do you think the funerals that have happened during COVID are going to continue? And I felt at the time, I don't know, I haven't got a clue. It could go either way, really. We could we could go down the route of smaller funerals and more private ones, and a greater degree of control, or people may react against that and go, no, we don't want that again. We don't, we don't want that kind of concealed death. We want to actually go back. We want to go back. We're going to go bigger. We want to go to the more celebrations of life, really embrace that person's identity. And I, now at the end of 2023, I don't really get a clear sense. It's the gut feeling of which way it is. And I think actually what has happened though is that direct cremation has become more normal as an option and a more legitimate choice to not have a funeral at all. So that spectrum of what's normal has expanded. But what I would say though, thinking about sort of resisting and counterculture, I gave a lecture this morning to second year students, and I invited, I don't think she's here tonight, but she's fantastic, a PhD student of ours called Polly Maxwell, and she's doing a study on queer families and queer approach, queer families being ones where there is a chosen family and it's people who live together and have potentially multiple relationships, and how end of life is experienced. And she was talking about how she knew of a direct cremation, had personal experience of a direct cremation that was chosen within a family network like that. And what happened was that it was partly chosen because of COVID. But what happened is that then 3 years later, they had a massive party. And actually, it went the other way. And I was blown away. I hadn't thought about our study at direct cremation. It was that people were retreating behind closed doors. This gave the option, direct cremation, we deal with the body, we get the ashes back. And at the time of our choosing, we will have an even bigger celebration that is a bigger party, that's more inclusive, that more people can come to. It's actually more full of life for this person who has died. And I thought that's incredible. This is so something that you would think is actually going smaller is actually enabling something bigger. But I do think it's still about control, and control is at the heart of it. And this is the thing that I think also we need to think about. A lot of the theories about death and dying have been created on the people who were dying who didn't live in a digital world, didn't live in a digital world, didn't live in a, as consumers. So the people who are going to be dying now have been consumers for 50, 60 years, really massive consumers, materialistic, used to, much more used to fulfilling their individual needs through consumption. So their expectations about what happens at the end of life are going to be shaped by that. And a lot of these theories that exist now will need to be updated to reflect that. They're kind of talking about people that no longer exist and a time that no longer exists. Thoughts to the historians?
My thoughts immediately are old customs in new clothes again. And I think Kate's made some valid points about these funerals that you describe in present day context. I think however, if we look at their historical roots, I mean, I immediately thought medieval trade guild funerals, and how funerals have always been, to some extent, one of the performances of identity. Whether that identity is real or desired or otherwise is a whole other set of issues, but they have always been. And I'm thinking also in terms of sort of historic counterculture thing, I'm thinking the Pearly King and Queen funerals as well, perhaps.
My mother works with a traveller community, and they have some really sort of powerful, big, socially integrated events. Lots and lots of ritual and things that must be kind of done, and often very big memorials and so on, which is really interesting. The other thing I think is interesting is the issue of class, because so it's become a bit of a sort of middle class thing to have a sort of what would have been in the 19th century a pauper burial, just be wrapped in an organic shroud and put in a organic meadow, and I think that's really interesting, the way that maybe once things become perhaps more affordable and possible, then sort of the money classes want to kind of re-fetishize really paring back. I find that really, it's like no we holiday in Cornwall because everyone can go abroad and get a tan. It's really interesting. It's exactly. So I think that's a really interesting point that you raise. Yeah.
Good. We've got quite a few hands up in online. So we go to Helen first. Helen, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm really interested in bringing the taboo of death, which is probably one of the last taboos. We actually talk about cancer now. And I'm interested in your work, but also bringing the idea of death and dying more immediate. And I'd be really interested in asking you and also the audience, how many people who've come to this talk because they're interested in death and dying and grieving would be interested in coming to a death cafe? Because I've run them in Bath before. And I think it's really important that people have that chance to explore their own death and dying, because it's very easy to talk about someone else's and talk about the history of it, but very few people want to confront it. And I think that's probably why so many people don't write wills and don't plan their funerals, which causes all sorts of problems with families, and why the royal family can, through bona vacantia, get loads of people's money. So I just think it would be interesting, on your views, the speaker's views, about death cafes per se. And I don't mean ones run by funeral directors. I'm talking about completely neutral, no agenda, well-run, safe spaces for people to talk about death and dying with no charge. So there's no difficulty going. So that's my question, please.
Thank you very much. I think they're always a good thing to be talking, but I think we're probably converted already. I mean, there would be no occasion when I'd say I wouldn't want to go to something like that and talk. And I don't know how the audience feels here, partly because you're here already. I can't say on your behalf, please do say. But one of the things I would say is that it makes me think immediately of the challenge of, for example, if you, as an academic, if we put on extra support sessions for students who are struggling, or students who aren't turning up to lectures and are disengaged with their studies, you can guarantee who's going to turn up to the extra sessions: the ones who are already engaged and the ones who are already thinking about it. And I think this is one of the challenges that we, we collectively have, is how do you engage people
who just don't want to be engaged on a topic? I mean, it's a genuine question. I don't know the answer.
I think as someone who talks about this topic a lot as a historical topic, and I can see Molly's nodding because she knows what I'm going to say, and it is that I get a quite surprising number of bookings from local history groups, WIs, U3A groups. Usually I'm contacted by a speaker secretary who says, I'm a little bit surprised that my committee want to book you. And I turn up and I never quite know how it's going to go. And usually it goes quite well, because I think sometimes if you sort of start to step away and you sort of sidle up to it, and you can either keep this kind of topic at one safe remove by talking about it as something in the past, or then you can you can sort of sidle up to it, can't you, Molly? And you can start to make it a little bit more personal and a bit more relatable. And that's something I find always comes out in the Q&A afterwards. And actually, when I run a workshop version of the talk as well, it's incredible that the engagement it gets. So I think it's just thinking through how you walk up to it.
All I can say is one of the worst ones ever was I was asked to do a talk by Bath WI about the history of the funeral, and just before I did the talk they were like, and now we've got a cake for Beryl's 95th birthday or something. Absolutely dreadful doing a talk after that. It does, but I think it is really interesting, and I'm sure, like others in the room, I've sort of worked with death cafes, and I do I sound a bit grim, but I call them death walks, where we kind of do walks and we look at the social history of dying and death. And what I find really interesting about those sessions is I think being in motion really opens people up, and people really share their experiences, either of obviously friends and family who have died, or their own health conditions, or their own sort of concerns about end of life. So I feel there are spaces where people will discuss it if you create a permissive pathway. I don't necessarily buy that we don't talk about death. I think sometimes it's just about how we create the spaces in which we can talk about death. So that's my.
Just to say, as a Bath resident, I absolutely think and I think this is what's happening. Dorothy House are working with Bath City Farm, which is based in Twerton and Whiteway, to do some kind of initiatives there that are about life cycles, or they're doing a repurposing of getting men especially involved in redoing up equipment, the repair cafe or repair sheds. There, maybe it's rather than going in there with death, you're talking about sort of cycles of life or cycles of repair and renewal, or that actually you can access it in a less kind of scary way.
Okay, on the back of Helen's comment about death cafes, Donata also made a comment in the chat room, but you also got your hand up, Donata. Would you like to ask a question or make an observation?
Yes, actually, I that was my question about death cafes. I'm in California. Hello from California.
Welcome.
Enjoyed your talk. And death cafes are in sometimes 2 per city around here, led by volunteers, with skills and experience, and it's very nice. So that's why I was wondering if they'd ever attended one. And then I Googled it and found out it started in London, the whole death cafe movement. But now it's franchised, which is interesting. Also, what I wanted to talk about is that another California, USA phenomenon is that you were talking about the mourning teapots. Well, you can have the ashes of your loved ones, blown into glass paperweights or put into a pottery, the ashes. And so I just think it's interesting now, your loved one is the teapot that you have as a remembrance. It's not just the teapot, they are the teapot.
Here in the room, we have a tray of Victorian mourning jewellery, and those of you who are here in the room are welcome to come and have a look afterwards, and we'll try and put it under the camera so those of you who are attending online can have a look as well. And I think what you've just described is another wonderful example of those sort of, again, new customs in old clothes, where you say is that the dead person has now become the jewellery. We've got a number of examples here of Victorian and Georgian hair work jewelry as well, which again, it's that sort of use, it's taking material signifiers to the nth degree.
Yeah. And this is an example again of kind of elite cultures sort of moving into to kind of more accessible forms. You used to be able to buy by the kind of later 19th century, you could buy a kit to make your own. So this is one I found in an Oxfam shop actually, which is just a sort of brass. You would buy a little brass sort of, well, I suppose this is like a pendant, and you could get your own DIY. How to weave your own hair. So I think it's always been there. It's really interesting. I found that really fascinating, the way we want to keep parts, physical parts of people, whether it's hair or and the fashion obviously for sort of death photography as well. In the later 19th century, the way we want to kind of integrate parts of the past and our ancestors into the living. It's kind of really, I'm fascinated, and I agree with the teapots. You can get photographs on mugs now as well. You can be distilled into a diamond type stone. It's really interesting that we want that presence, isn't it? That physicality that doesn't seem to leave us actually.
Okay, we've got another hand up online, and then we go back in the room for another question. Michaela, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, please. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm a historian of the French Revolution myself, and I'm currently working on a piece about responses to the death of Louis XVI. So I was wondering if, like, either of the historians might have any thoughts on grief for public figures, specifically the time before modern media, because I'm in my sources, I'm finding like real grief responses to this death of someone people have never met. But I haven't been able to find any scholarship about this. So I'd be really curious about what you guys think.
John Wolfe's book, Great Deaths, that's a good place to start, particularly for the, I'd say, Victorian period. Molly, have you got any thoughts?
I mean, I think that's a really, really interesting topic because a lot of the accounts, inevitably, if you're sort of researching sort of 18th and 19th century history, a lot of the accounts we have of funerals are inevitably, sort of big public funerals like the Duke of Wellington or, royals and aristocrats and so on. And this very sort of stylized and organized, this kind of shift into almost a sort of public expectation that people should mourn because this was a great person. And I think it's really fascinating. I think there's a really interesting piece of work to be done on how people actually genuinely interacted with that. And I guess thinking, perhaps within living memory of the room, something like Princess Diana, for example, is a kind of really obvious, or Elizabeth, late Queen. How people are kind of interacting, because some people were clearly experiencing grief. I speak as a Republican here, so I kind of found it kind of fascinating because I was abstract kind of voices and positions of power. But I think it would be a really interesting, possibly sociological study. I'm sure there might be work on it, on how people are interacting with these figures of hierarchy and power in their moment of mortality.
If anyone's interested in that, Tony Walter, who's on the call, probably the most preeminent sociologist in death that this country has ever had. Hi, Tony. Who's also written many books, but I've brought two here, which you're welcome to look at in the room. What Death Means Now and Death in the Modern World. Brilliant. Just overviews of where we're at. Tony's written a lot about that, about public mourning and the expression of grief for people you didn't know. And there was quite a lot when Diana died. Yes, there was a lot. There was a sort of peak of work in that field. But it was there this week. It was on the radio. I heard, I think Ian Dale discussed it on LBC, because we had the other day Alistair Darling, Shane McGowan and Henry Kissinger all die within 24 hours of one another. And the debate of also that it was Shane McGowan's death that led the news, and that kind of why was his death one thing is getting more coverage, but also why was it that more affecting than the other two in terms of actual influence in the world and impact? What was going on?
Just just to say as well, particularly in the 19th century, sort of when the trade union movement really developed, there were also really big, trade union funerals. Or if there's a firefighter in Bristol, and whose name escapes me to my shame, but he died very bravely putting out a fire in the late 19th century. There's a huge public funeral. So there were also obviously sort of signal figures. It wasn't. I'm just sort of undermining my earlier point here. It wasn't always just about sort of wealthy elites, and I think some of the guild funerals and some of the union funerals and some of the the sort of the mutual savings associations, they would have like very big sort of public mourning as well. So yeah, there is something very interesting to be done, and Tony's books are excellent place to begin, aren't they?
Okay, thank you for that. We've probably got enough time for one or two questions. Does anybody have a question in the room before I go to the online? There's a gentleman at the front. I just have to slowly make my way forward. There we go.
I'm going to be a bit contentious, as I usually am. I'm going to be a little bit contentious by saying that perhaps the last 20 or 30 years has been an unusual period in terms of grief, and that there's been a huge amount of denial, particularly in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And I detect that people are much more likely to talk about death and bereavement now, and that they use alternative ways of communicating, such as social media, which I don't understand, but I bet they do. And so I think perhaps we're talking about a phenomenon that was part of urbanization and people moving away from where they've been born and things like that, and that we're now beginning to overcome it, which I think is an excellent thing, because I think grief and bereavement, and talking about it and talking to other people about our experiences, is the way people recover from loss, and it underlines people's resilience. And just one final point, DSM-6, which you mentioned, is a billing mechanism. It's not a diagnostic mechanism at all, and it's certainly not used in England.
No. So the DSM is from the States. So that's but it's being referred to in academia in terms of the impact it may have in terms of setting the standards for what happens. But apologies, I didn't. That was my misunderstanding. No, I think you're right. Actually, that also what has changed in the last 10 or 20 years, and there's a lot of work going on in this area, is the digital world, and the fact that now a lot more information is stored on there, and which is going to change how, when people die, what information is readily accessible. That that will they feel the need to have a funeral or perhaps have a gravestone because actually they've got their marker in the world in a different way.
If I may refer to that great academic source, the Daily Mail. A couple of days ago, actually, that there was an article. This has been something that's going on for a while. There was an article about the sort of how AI is both changing grief customs, but also, again, continuing trends from earlier years and decades and centuries that, you can, for the appropriate monthly fee, of course, you can purchase a simulacrum of your deceased loved one and interact with them, and that draws on social media material, audio visual data generated during life, and you can actually have a conversation with them and get answers back. And you can see Granny for I think about £6.40 a month, I think. And again, this is part of a longer thing of people finding means to continue having that relationship, whether it's wearing a mourning brooch or keeping the mourning card on the mantelpiece, or sort of having a photograph of somebody or whatever. But it is part of a longer trend of people using whatever means and technology is available at the time to keep having that relationship with the person they've lost.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time for further questions.